Emma called me on a Wednesday morning from her university office. She is 23 years old. She teaches one section of introductory literature as a graduate teaching assistant while she completes her doctoral research. She called at 9:47, which is between her morning seminar and her office hours, and which told me she had something specific to say that could not wait until the weekend. She said, "Grandma, I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "My tuition remission for the doctoral program, the fellowship that covers the gap between what the university pays and the actual cost. I was looking at my financial aid documents this morning because Ryan and I are applying for a mortgage and the bank needs a full financial picture." She stopped. I said, "Yes." She said, "Grandma, the fellowship is called the Eleanor R. Brooks Educational Foundation Award." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been receiving this fellowship for 3 years. It has paid $14,000 per year toward my doctoral program." I said, "Yes." She said, "I did not know your middle name was Ruth until this morning." I said, "Most people do not." She said, "Grandma." I said, "Yes, Emma." She said, "Is this you?" I did not answer immediately. I thought about 3 years of direct transfers to the university's financial aid office, of Margaret filing the paperwork, of Patricia ensuring the foundation was structured so that no recipient could easily identify the donor. Then I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Because I did not give it so you would know. I gave it so you could finish." My name is Eleanor Brooks, 63 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher. I want to tell you about Emma before I tell you about the foundation. Emma Brooks Calloway is 23 years old. She is Ryan's wife. She is Lucas's daughter. She is my granddaughter. She is the person who stood up at a wedding reception and named something out loud that needed to be named. She is the person who sends me photographs of her daughter Rose reaching for my pearl earrings. She is the person who told me on a Thursday afternoon that she could always see me from the aisle, even from table 2. She is studying Victorian literature at a university in Boston. She has been studying it for 3 years. She chose it the way people choose the thing that has always been choosing them. She read her first Victorian novel at 14, sitting in my living room on a summer afternoon. She came to me after and said, "Grandma, these people, the way they talk around the things they actually mean, it is the most interesting thing I have ever read." I said, "That is what literature is for, to show us what people cannot say directly." She said, "I want to understand how they do it, how the words work underneath the words." I said, "That is called close reading, and it is a life's work if you let it be." She let it be. She completed her undergraduate degree. She was accepted to a doctoral program at a university in Boston with a partial fellowship. The partial fellowship covered approximately 60% of the actual cost. The remaining 40%, $14,000 per year, represented the gap between what she could manage and what the program actually required. I found out about the gap 3 years ago. Not from Emma, from Ryan. Ryan called me on a Tuesday evening. He said, "Mrs. Brooks, I want to ask your advice about something. Emma has been accepted to her doctoral program. The partial fellowship is strong, but there is a gap. She is looking at taking out loans to cover it. She does not want to ask anyone in the family because she knows everyone has been through a difficult year financially." He said, "I do not want her to start a doctoral program with debt she does not need to carry. But I do not know how to suggest other options without her feeling like she has failed to manage it herself." I said, "Ryan, thank you for calling me." He said, "Of course. You are the person I call when I do not know what to do." I said, "Leave it with me." I called Patricia the next morning. I said, "I want to establish a small educational foundation, named for me, but not identifiably so. It will award an annual fellowship to doctoral students in the humanities. The first recipient will be Emma Brooks Calloway at her university in Boston. $14,000 per year for the duration of her program." Patricia said, "How long is the program?" I said, 4 to 6 years depending on the dissertation timeline. She said, that is up to $84,000. I said, yes. She said, Eleanor. I said, yes. She said, are you certain? I said, Margaret reviewed my accounts last month. I am certain. She said, the foundation name. I said, the Eleanor R. Brooks Educational Foundation. The R is for Ruth, my middle name. No one uses it. Emma will not connect it. She said, and if she does? I said, then we have a conversation, but I would like to give her 3 years of uninterrupted work before that conversation happens. Patricia said, I will have the paperwork ready by Friday. I signed it on Friday. The first transfer went to Emma's University Financial Aid Office the following September. Emma received notification of the Fellowship Award in a letter from the Financial Aid Office. The letter said, you have been selected as the recipient of the Eleanor R. Brooks Educational Foundation Award. This award is given annually to a doctoral student demonstrating exceptional scholarly promise in the humanities. She had emailed me the day she received it. She said, Grandma, I got a fellowship, a private foundation. I do not know who they are, but someone believes in what I am doing. I wanted to tell you because you are the reason I believed in it first. I had read that email 3 times. Then I had written back, that is wonderful. Emma, you deserve every bit of it. I had not told her it was me. For 3 years. Until a Wednesday morning when she was applying for a mortgage and her bank asked for a full financial picture and the name Eleanor R. Brooks appeared in her documents and she looked up her middle name. If you have ever given something to someone you love without needing them to know it was you, stay with me. Because what Emma said when she called that morning is something I want you to hear completely. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week. She was quiet for a long time after I said yes. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the silence of someone who has too much and is trying to find where to begin. I let her have it. I have learned over 63 years that the most important thing you can do when someone is processing something significant is to not fill the silence before they are ready to fill it themselves. She said, 3 years. I said, yes. She said, $14,000 a year. I said, yes. She said, Grandma, that is $42,000. I said, yes. She said, I have been thanking a foundation for 3 years. I sent a formal thank you letter every September. I addressed it to the foundation board. I said, I received those letters. She said, you received them. I said, Patricia forwards them to me. I have kept all 3. She said, what did they say? I said, the first one said you were grateful for the support and that you hoped to honor it by producing work that mattered. The second one said you had completed your coursework and were beginning your dissertation research, and that the financial stability the fellowship provided had allowed you to focus on the work rather than on the debt. The third one said that your dissertation chapter had been accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal and that you believed the foundation's investment was beginning to produce something real. She said nothing. I said, that third letter arrived in April. I read it on a Tuesday morning at my kitchen table with my coffee. She said, Grandma. I said, yes. She said, why did you not tell me? I said, I told you already. I did not give it so you would know. I gave it so you could finish. She said, but 3 years of not knowing. I said, Emma, do you remember what you said to me when you told me about the fellowship? The day you received the notification? She was quiet. I said, you emailed me. You said you did not know who they were, but someone believed in what you were doing. You said you wanted to tell me because I was the reason you believed in it first. She said, I remember. I said, that email told me everything I needed to know. You received the support and you felt believed in. That was the purpose, not the recognition. She said, but you deserve the recognition. I said, I deserve to watch you finish. That is the recognition I wanted. She said, Ryan knew. I said, Ryan called me. He was worried about the debt. He wanted to find a way to help without you feeling managed. I thought a foundation was cleaner than a family gift. She said, because a family gift has weight. I said, yes. A family gift comes with the awareness of what it costs someone. A fellowship comes with the freedom to receive it as something you earned. She said, I did earn it. They selected me from applicants. I said, yes. Patricia ensured the foundation had a legitimate selection process. There were other applicants. You were selected on the merit of your application. She said, but you created the foundation for me. I said, I created the foundation for doctoral students in the humanities who needed a gap filled. The first recipient was you because Ryan told me about the gap and because your application was the strongest one submitted. She said, Grandma, you cannot say that. I said, Patricia can confirm it. The selection committee was independent. I was not on it. She said, you created the conditions. I said, yes, I created the conditions. You filled them. She was quiet again. Then she said, I am at my desk right now, in my office. I have a class in 40 minutes. I said, I know. She said, I cannot go to class like this. I said, yes, you can. You have been going to class for 3 years on the foundation's support. Today is the same as every other day, except now you know. She said, it is not the same. I said, no, it is not exactly the same. But the work is the same. The dissertation is the same. The chapter that was accepted for publication is the same. Those things belong to you. They were always yours. She said, Grandma. I said, yes. She said, I need to tell you something. I said, tell me. She said, the chapter, the one that was accepted for publication. It is about Victorian epistolary novels, about letters, about what it means to communicate something important through writing rather than speech, about the particular courage of putting words on paper for someone to receive without being able to see your face when they read them. I said, yes, you told me about the chapter. She said, I dedicated it. I said, I know. You told me it was dedicated to your grandmother. She said, yes, but I want to tell you what the dedication says. Exactly. I said, tell me. She said, it says, for Eleanor, who showed me that literature is what people cannot say directly, and who has been saying the important things indirectly for as long as I can remember. The kitchen was very quiet. I held the phone. I said, Emma. She said, yes. I said, that is a very good dedication. She said, it was already true when I wrote it. I did not know how true. I said, yes. She said, Grandma, I need to ask you something. I said, ask. She said, are you still funding the foundation? For other students? I said, yes. The foundation has awarded fellowships to 6 students over 3 years. You are not the only one. She said, 6 students. I said, 6 doctoral students in the humanities who had gaps between their fellowships and their actual costs. Margaret manages the applications. Patricia manages the legal structure. She said, this has been happening for 3 years and I did not know. I said, you knew about your own fellowship. You did not know the source. She said, Grandma, who are the other 5? I said, I will not tell you their names. They have the same right to receive support without the weight of knowing the source. She said, but they will find out, the way I found out. I said, perhaps, when they apply for mortgages or review financial documents carefully. That is acceptable. The support will have done its work by then. She said, like mine did. I said, like yours did. Yes. If this moment reached something in you, leave me a comment. Tell me if someone ever gave you something important without needing you to know it was them. Tell me what it meant when you found out. I read every single one. Emma came on Saturday. She drove from Boston. 3 hours. She arrived at 11:47, which is earlier than she said she would come, and which told me the drive had started earlier than planned. She came through the front door, and she stopped in the hallway, and she looked at me. And then, she did something she had not done since she was 6 years old. She walked to me, and she put her arms around me, and she held on. Not the quick hug of an adult greeting a grandmother, the hold of someone who has been carrying something for 3 days and has finally arrived somewhere they can put it down. I held her back. We stood in my hallway for a long time. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. Some things do not require words. That is also something literature taught me. The things that matter most often arrive in the silence between the sentences. Then she stepped back. Her eyes were bright. She said, "I practiced what I was going to say. On the drive, I had a whole speech." I said, "You do not need a speech." She said, "I know, but I had one." I said, "Tell me the speech." She said, "It was about gratitude, about how to say thank you for something that is larger than thank you can hold, about how you changed the shape of my life by filling a gap I did not know how to fill myself." She said, "But when I got here and saw you standing there, I realized the speech was wrong." I said, "What was wrong about it?" She said, "It was about what you did. What I wanted to say is about who you are." I said, "Tell me." She said, "You are the person who told me that literature is what people cannot say directly. You taught me that the real meaning is always underneath the surface, that the most important communication happens in the space between what is said and what is meant." She said, "And then you spent 3 years communicating something enormous in exactly that way, not through words, through an act, through a foundation with a name no one would recognize, through $14,000 a year transferred quietly to a financial aid office, through 3 formal thank you letters you kept in a file somewhere." I said, "In my desk drawer." She said, "In your desk drawer." She said, "Grandma, I have been studying Victorian letters for 3 years, about the courage it takes to put something important on paper, to send it without being able to see the face of the person who receives it." She said, "You did not put it on paper. You put it in a financial transfer. You put it in a foundation name. You put it in a selection process that was real so that I would never know if I had been chosen or simply given." I said, "You were chosen. I told you that." She said, "I know, and that matters more than you know, that you created something real, that the other 5 students are real, that this is not just for me." I said, "It was never just for you. It was for the work, for doctoral students who need gaps filled so they can do the work." She said, "But the first gap you filled was mine." I said, "The first gap I knew about was yours." "Yes." She said, "Because Ryan called you." I said, "Because Ryan called me on a Tuesday evening and said he did not want you to start your program carrying debt you did not need to carry. Because Ryan understood something about you that told him you needed support that did not feel like support." She said, "He knows me well." I said, "Yes, he does. That is why you married him." She smiled, a real one. She said, "Can I see them?" I said, "What?" She said, "The 3 letters, the ones I sent to the foundation." I went to my desk drawer. I brought back 3 envelopes. She opened the first one. She read it. She said, "I was so formal. Dear Foundation Board, thank you for your generous support." I said, "You were addressing a foundation board. Formal was appropriate." She opened the second one. She read it. She said, "I was less formal by the second year." I said, "Yes." The second letter was warmer. You said the fellowship had changed how you slept at night, that you had stopped waking at 3 in the morning, calculating whether you could sustain the program. She looked up. I said, "That sentence stayed with me." She said, "I did not know I was writing it to you." I said, "I know. That is why it was honest." She opened the third one. She read it. When she finished, she looked at the letter for a long time. She said, "I wrote that the foundation's investment was beginning to produce something real." I said, "Yes." She said, And 2 weeks later, the chapter was accepted for publication. I said, "Yes." She said, "Grandma, the dedication." I said, "Yes." She said, "I wrote it 6 months ago, before this morning, before I knew." I said, "I know." She said, "I said you showed me that literature is what people cannot say directly." I said, "Yes." She said, "You have been doing it my entire life." I said, "Literature is not only in books, Emma." She said, "No, it is not." Ryan arrived at 1. He had driven separately. He had known she needed the morning alone. He came in, and he looked at Emma, and he looked at me, and he said, "I see you found out." Emma said, "You knew she would call you." He said, "I knew she would find out eventually. The mortgage application has a way of revealing things." Emma said, "You told her about the gap." He said, "Yes." Emma said, 3 years ago." He said, "Yes." Emma said, "Ryan." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I called the right person. That is all I did." I said, "It is never all. Calling the right person at the right moment is the most important thing. It is what changes the shape of what happens next." Ryan looked at me. He said, "Mrs. Brooks, the library designs. Marcus Webb called me this week. The reading room in New Haven." I said, "Yes, I am going next Thursday." He said, "He mentioned there might be a dedication plaque for the room." I said, "I know nothing about a dedication plaque." He said the school wanted to name the room." I said, "After whom?" Ryan said, "He said the principal had a specific suggestion. A teacher from 1994 who had told her something was already there." I looked at Ryan. He smiled. I said, "Maria Santos." He said, "Yes, she wants to name the reading room for you." I said, "That is not necessary." He said, "She said you would say that." I said, "It is a room for students. It should have a name that belongs to students." He said, "She said you would say that too. She said to tell you, the room already has a name. It is just waiting for you to accept it." I sat with that for a moment. Emma said, "Grandma." I said, "Yes." She said, "Let her name the room." I said, "Emma." She said, "You spent 3 years funding 6 doctoral students quietly. You spent 22 years telling students the words were already there. You told Marcus it was already him. You told Maria this was the beginning of something." She said, "Let someone name a room for you." I looked at my granddaughter, 23 years old, 3 thank you letters to a foundation she did not know was her grandmother, a dissertation chapter dedicated to someone who had been saying the important things indirectly for as long as she could remember. I said, "I will think about it." She said, "That means yes." I said, "It means I will think about it." She said, "I know what it means." It is Monday morning. Emma called last night from Boston. She said, "I told Ryan about the other 5 students. He cried." I said, "Ryan cries easily. It is one of his best qualities." She said, "Grandma, the foundation. Are you going to keep funding it?" I said, "Yes, as long as the finances support it and the students apply." She said, "Can I help? With the selection process?" I said, "Patricia manages the selection committee." She said, "I know, but I am a doctoral student in the humanities. I understand what the gap looks like from inside. I might be useful." I thought about that. I said, "I will talk to Patricia." She said, "Okay." She said, "Grandma." I went to my office this morning to prepare for my seminar. I said, "Yes." She said, "I looked at my desk, at the books, at the notes for the dissertation." I said, "Yes." She said, "It looked the same as every other Monday." I said, "Yes." She said, "But I looked at it differently." I said, "How?" She said, Like something that was always mine, something no one gave me, something I built. I said, yes, because that is what it is. She said, but you made the conditions. I said, yes, and you filled them. Those are different things, both true simultaneously. She said, thank you, Grandma. I said, the chapter was accepted for publication on its merit. The foundation selected you on your merit. Those things belong to you. She said, I know, but thank you anyway. I said, you are welcome, Emma. $14,000 a year, 3 years, 6 students who woke up at 3 in the morning calculating whether they could sustain the work. 3 formal letters addressed to a foundation board, 1 dedication in a peer-reviewed journal, 1 granddaughter in a hallway who held on for a long time. I did not give it so she would know. I gave it so she could finish. She finished. That is the only recognition I needed. That has always been the only recognition I needed. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever given you something important without needing you to know it was them? Tell me what it was and what it meant when you finally found out. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you today, subscribe, because next week's story will stay with you too.